she could have taken the easy road, and she refused. She said, no, I will stay and I will fight. And she did so to such a degree, and this is one of the most extraordinary things of her story, that, she was very quickly serving alongside, seasoned, experienced intelligence operatives.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm your host and the editor, and today's episode is a chat with Damien Lewis, the author of Flame of Resistance. And this is the story of Josephine Baker, who was an amazing woman. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1908, and she lived her early years in poverty. She later became a stage performer, but a big break came in Paris, where she achieved huge success and adoration. But then came the war, and her role changed as she became a brilliant secret agent against the Nazis. It's a wonderful tale, but a heartbreaking one too, and so well told by Damien in his new book. Damien Lewis is a #1 best-selling author whose books have been translated into over 40 languages worldwide. Previously, he's worked as a war and conflict reporter for the world's major broadcasters. Now, this episode is being released during the Jubilee weekend. If you haven't heard Tessa Dunlap's pod about the Queen during World War II in our Jubilee special, I recommend that. And then I also have seen that Gavin Mortimer, last week's guest, has been prompting plenty of discussion about David Stirling, the phony major. If you can like or subscribe, that would be wonderful. But I hope you enjoy the story of Josephine Baker. Damien Lewis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So today we're talking about an incredible individual and the subject of your new book, your latest book, The Flame of Resistance, and that's Josephine Baker. Now, I had never heard of Josephine Baker until I picked up this book, and it's the most extraordinary story. And it appears from having read the introduction a little bit of a labor of love for you. You've been working on this for quite a long time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, off and on for 10 years. Researching and digging and unearthing layers of the story. It's been as much a detective story as a work of history, because many of the aspects of the war, particularly in France, where you obviously had French men and French women pitted against each other. A lot of the aspects of that story have been layered in levels of intrigue and secrecy, because there were clearly things that people wanted to obfuscate and cover up and felt they couldn't tell. And indeed, when you're talking about, the operations of the intelligence services, many people choose to go to their graves with those secrets untold. And a lot of that happened with relation to this story.
And Josephine Baker herself, she's much better known in France, but could you just explain who she was before we go into the story itself during the war?
Yeah, so Josephine was she was born in America, in St. Louis. She was born to a black mother, but her father, on that side, the parentage is uncertain. But she grew up basically in poverty in St. Louis, and she saw her means to escape that being her talent as a singer and a dancer. And so she left home at the earliest possible age and made her way basically to Broadway, and managed to get herself a place on a Broadway act as a chorus girl. And she tried to forge a career largely in New York, on the stage. As a dancer and a singer, and was mostly unsuccessful, largely due to the prejudice that then pertained in America, where segregation was still, very much the thing. And so, at the tender age of age 19, she accepted a invitation to sail to France, to Paris, and to play the leading role in a show called Le Revue Negre. Which was a kind of scantily clad, some would say shocking, provocative act, but which, as it happened, took Paris by storm. And in Paris, Josephine and her fellow dancers and singers found themselves, as you would in most of Europe at that time, in a comparatively prejudice-free part of the world. And very quickly, Josephine made Paris her adopted home, where she was feted by high society and the French people alike, and very quickly became a standout star, a superstar, in fact, of the 1920s and 30s. And prior to the war, to give you an indication of how famous she was the most photographed woman in the world at that stage. And she was one of the first women ever to play a starring role in the movies that she'd acted in. So she really had, and she'd performed and toured all over the world, Britain, across Europe, South America, and further afield. So she really was, a pre-war superstar, and that's how she is largely known by those who know of her to this day.
And so we'll come to her activities during the war in more detail, but the role that she played, how has that become apparent in France, or is it a sort of an unknown element of her activity during the war, her espionage?
Her wartime story is really largely unknown, even in France. And as you know, Josephine Baker was elevated to the French Pantheon, where it's the highest honor in the nation. Very recently, in the last few months.
Yes, that was in November, wasn't it? I was reading about that.
In November, yeah. And she's one of only 80 odd individuals in the Pantheon, so it's an incredible honor. And the French government, French president, cited her wartime role as one of the main reasons, but no one really knows what that wartime role entailed, certainly any detail, and that's largely because. When you served in the French intelligence services and the Allied intelligence services, you were expected to remain silent for at least 30 years and really for the rest of your life. And so, because Josephine died, basically 30 years after the end of the war, those espionage activities in which she became such a master were things that she really couldn't speak about. So the story has to be compiled from the testimonies and the stories told by those individuals who served alongside her, because she was part of a team, very much part of a team, and also, from the documents that are now being released, very fortunately by the French and British governments, which lend depth and truth to the incredible wartime exploits. So,
really, her activity starts quite soon after the Germans invade France, and it's an extraordinary time, which you describe really well in the book, actually, that the way once the Germans invade, the sort of feeling in Paris when it's chaos, isn't it? But for the French, I mean, what was it like in the immediate aftermath of the invasion? Because it's not something that we in Britain, I think, are particularly aware of. We know Dunkirk and then Europe is under the Nazi jackboot. But what was life like in Paris in the immediate aftermath of the invasion?
Well, of course, France had suffered terribly in the First World War, as had Britain and other nations, and Germany included. And so the French people were very war weary, even as the Second World War loomed on the horizon. The French intelligence services, the Deuxième Bureau in particular, which was the arm that Josephine ended up being recruited by, they knew war was coming. They long before Hitler marched his legions into Western Europe, they knew war was coming, and they were also convinced that France would fall, that France could not stand. The Maginot Line was completely outdated and outmoded. It would be bypassed, and France would not stand. And so they tried to put in place safeguards, especially in terms of intelligence gathering, so that when a significant proportion of France was occupied by Nazi Germany, as they believed it would be, they could still manage to gather intelligence and get intelligence out of France to aid the Allies. What happened, of course, was the precipitate fall of France to the Blitzkrieg. In a matter of weeks, all of France had either fallen under Nazi Germany's control or been turned into the Vichy French, a zone of Vichy French control. So that the speed of the collapse was meant that everyone was blindsided, not just the French, actually, not just French intelligence, British intelligence too. One of the extraordinary things about, that I learned via writing the book was that, after the fall of France, the Secret Intelligence Service and British intelligence services had no agents at all of any shape or form anywhere in France. It was a blank canvas. And so I think the speed of that collapse and I guess the shame of that collapse and the shock of that collapse meant that, they coined a phrase in Paris, the dishonorable peace, la paix honteuse. So, we have to make an accommodation with our occupiers, and it may be dishonorable and it may be distasteful, but this is the price of survival. And so when General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, and embraced by Churchill, came to Britain and gave his June 1940 speech to, a call to arms to the French people to rise up. Practically nobody heard him. And those that did hear him, very few were minded to pay heed. So it was a largely collaborationist, defeatist mindset right at that very outset. And as you say, it's something that I don't think we're very aware of in the UK, because we were not invaded, and so we have no experience of that. It's a situation that ended up pitting, French men and French women against each other, and families against each other, fratricidally, in really bitter and horrific disputes and warfare. And that's something that this country, Britain, managed to avoid.
So, how was Josephine recruited?
Basically, prior to the war, the single greatest challenge for the French intelligence services, and indeed for the British intelligence services, and Churchill railed against this repeatedly, was lack of funding and lack of staff. Peace dividend after the First World War, the intelligence services in Britain and France were cut to the bone. And so, as Nazi Germany flooded France in particular with agents of the Abwehr, the German Foreign Intelligence Service, France was inundated, and the Deuxième Bureau, the counter-espionage service, so those tasked with trying to fight against the flood of German agents coming in, were completely snowed under. Very, very few agents and very little funding. And so there was a standout traitor called Ensign Aubert, who was a French naval officer who not only sold out suitcase loads of French secrets to the Germans, literally carried them to Belgium and handed them over, but also was in the process of selling out the French naval codes to the Germans when he was captured. So, the Germans would have been able to read every single signal sent by the French fleet, which was the fourth most powerful in the world at the time. And so the Deuxième Bureau realized that they needed to try to boost their agent numbers, and without a budget to do so, and without any support from the French government, really, who really did not want to face what was coming, they decided to utilize a system called the honorable correspondence. And basically, these are freelance, voluntary agents, spies, who are recruited to carry out espionage on behalf of a government out of patriotism, and with a willingness and an ability, because of what they do, largely with to do with their work, to travel freely and to carry out espionage. So classically it would be businessmen, it would be journalists, actually it would be anybody who could put themselves in a situation where they could gather useful intelligence, and also who had the ability to do so and not lose their nerve. And bear in mind, these were individuals who not only did they generally went everywhere unarmed, but they had very little backup if they were uncovered. And despite the fact they were freelance spies, that wouldn't alter the fact that if they were captured, they would face horrendous consequences. I mean, two German female spies who were captured spying on behalf of Poland, actually, just before the war, were both beheaded by the Germans, and that was their punishment for espionage, was to be beheaded. So yeah, you face terrible consequences. And in the process of recruiting a new raft of honourable correspondents, one of the impresarios, so the theatrical managers for Josephine Baker, suggested that she would be the perfect recruit. And the deuxième bureau were most unkeen because, at that time, women were not seen as being prime intelligence material. The case of Mata Hari, the famous spy in the First World War who had been a double agent for the Germans and been captured or exposed, was still, very strong in everybody's mind. But I guess most importantly, the reservation was that, this was a global superstar. And how on earth could a global superstar be expected to slip through the enemy's clutches unnoticed and gather intelligence? Because their very profile would surely mitigate against that. But the agent who was tasked to go and approach Josephine Baker, he was an individual called Captain Jacques Abte, a Frenchman, but brought up on the region bordering Germany, so fluent in German, and with a somewhat Germanic appearance. When he went to recruit her, or to approach her to sound her out, he was very, very skeptical and doubtful. He expected her to be one of those showbiz personalities who would shatter like glass at the first hint of danger. And he drove out to her home in a region called Le Vessinet, at the Le Beauchesne, a kind of chateau on the outskirts of Paris, expecting to be met by the typical Josephine Baker figure, dressed in scantily clad designer clothes, looking, $1 million. And actually he turned up there and a figure emerged from the bushes of the garden, dressed in a pair of gardening trousers and an old battered felt hat, with a tin of snails in one hand, which she had been gathering to feed to her ducks. So this was the other side of Josephine Baker that she kept very hidden. This was the down-to-earth, feisty, very practical, and very, very unrefined, very natural side of her that he just hadn't been expecting. And she welcomed him in, took him into her chateau, to the drawing room. They sat in front of the fire. And very quickly, actually, Abte started to realize what it was about this woman who had made her such an incredible superstar, especially on the stage. And that was that she had this almost unique ability. And I've had it described to me by one of her dancers who's still alive, a guy called Jean-Pierre Reggiori. And he described her ability to reach out from the stage and to make every single one of her audience feel not just special, but as if she was speaking directly to him or her, touching them in their heart and their soul. So that ability to do that was very unique. And Abte felt that when he sat down to speak to her. He felt this powerful connection. And he realized pretty quickly that if they could harness that to the ends of intelligence gathering, and if she were willing and able, then they potentially had a very potent and powerful special agent, honorable correspondent on their hands. And so he said to her, would you, words to the effect of, would you be willing to serve and be recruited, to the deuxième bureau? And she basically said words to the effect, France has made me all that I am, and I am ready to give France and the Allies my life. And so, very quickly she basically signed up and said, what do you need me to do? And he said, well, you need to think of yourselves now as one of the team. You are now one of the deuxième bureau's brothers. And the first, I guess, test that he set her was that at that stage, and we're talking before war's outbreak, none of the Allies knew what the intentions of the Italians, Mussolini, would be once war was declared. And of course, we needed to know. It was absolutely vital to know, especially for, control of the Mediterranean, apart from many other things. And so Abte said to her, look, you have a very special in with the Italian embassy in Paris. Go there, use your charms and your powers and your very prestige, your very profile, to try to winkle out of the Italians what their intentions are. And about 7 days later, she called him up and said, look, we need to meet. And nothing would ever be said over the phone, which was revealing. And they met in central Paris, and she said, and she revealed to him exactly what the Italian intentions were, that Mussolini had already made a pact with Hitler, and that once war was declared, that would be the access, that would be the alliance that was struck.
It's it's such an incredible story of how her motivation is patriotism for France, isn't it? Which is, it's really striking, her love for France, and I guess that's tied up with her personality. There's a wonderful scene in the book where she gets everyone up and dancing. She sort of drags people up from their chairs and gets them dancing. But she really just fell in love with France almost as soon as she arrived, didn't she? And that's her main motivation for working for the Deuxième Bureau.
Well, she fell in love with France, but bear in mind the French people fell in love with her, but also the people of Europe fell in love with her, the people of Britain fell in love with her, the people of Holland, Sweden, Switzerland, Italy even fell in love with her. So this was a mutual thing. I think she found the freedom of Europe after America immensely invigorating and refreshing, and she felt she could breathe. But more importantly, she had also been to perform in Austria and Germany. And the first time she'd been there, a decade or more before the war, she had been feted and welcomed with open arms. And then she'd been there, several years after, and had an absolutely horrendous time, horrific, and seen for herself the true face of Nazism. Because of course, being black and being a woman and actually being married to a Jewish man at the time, she was, public enemy number one. And Goering, Hitler's propagandist in chief, had made it completely clear. He'd published leaflets in which he'd basically identified Josephine Baker as epitomizing all that the Nazi regime stood against. And so when the drums of war were beating from Berlin ever more powerfully, you can imagine it from her perspective. She had fled America, where she had been plagued by prejudice. She'd arrived in Europe, which was this dream world where she felt she could be who she wanted to be, and indeed she had, she'd achieved that. And suddenly it looked as if, at the behest of Hitler and his cronies, all of that was going to be taken away from her. And if Nazi Germany wasn't fought and defeated, then where in the free world would survive? Because of course, the Third Reich was all about world domination. And if Hitler and his cronies achieved their aims, where in the world could someone like Josephine Baker and all the other, Josephine Bakers of the world perform and flourish if they were ascendant? So, she had a absolutely driving reason to stand and fight. That being said, she was American of birth, and she was a very, very high-profile American citizen. So when war broke out and when Nazi Germany invaded, as did many, many Americans, she could simply have gone to the American embassy in Paris and said, look, get me out, get me back to America, get me to safety. She could have taken the easy road, and she refused. She said, no, I will stay and I will fight. And she did so to such a degree, and this is one of the most extraordinary things of her story, that, she was very quickly serving alongside, seasoned, experienced intelligence operatives, not just Jacques Abtey, but Jacques Abtey's boss, Colonel Paul Pelliol, who became the head of the kind of clandestine French intelligence service during the war. A hugely experienced, towering individual within intelligence circles. And to a man, they all say of her, during the war years, and from the very get-go, from the outset, they all say of her, the most extraordinary thing about her was she never faltered. She never believed for one moment, or feared for one moment, that the Allies would not win and that good would not overcome. And she was always convinced from the very outset that America would join the war in due course. And once America joined the war, the tide of the fortune of the conflict would turn.
So before America joined the war, Britain stood against the Germans in isolation. And so the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was working with, I guess, de Gaulle's Free French intelligence service, but also the Vichy, the SIS were keen to maintain links with Vichy, but they at the same time didn't want the Free French to be aware of that. So it's quite an interesting dynamic with the three different intelligence organizations.
Yeah, it was a very, very difficult balancing act for British Secret Intelligence Service. On the one hand, they had de Gaulle sitting in London, who was busy founding his own Free French Intelligence Service, which went through various names and iterations. So let's just call it the Free French Intelligence Service. On the other hand, you had Paul Pelol, head of the Deuxième Bureau, and many other seasoned intelligence operatives who are now officially running an intelligence operation for the Vichy French government, but unofficially, beneath that, running a shadow organization which aimed to gather intelligence for the Allies. And just to give you an example, to put some flesh on the bones of that, Pelol set up what he called the Travail Ruraux, which is rural works program. And basically, his intelligence agents posed as rural development workers. That's the cover he gave them, because he realized that posing as rural development workers, they could travel all over France, pretending to be interested in vineyards or orchards or cornfields or whatever it might be, and actually they could be gathering intelligence. It provided the perfect cover. So Pelol was busy setting up his shadow intelligence network, while ostensibly actually working as an intelligence, chief for an intelligence organization which was serving the Vichy regime, which was allied to the Germans. So this was a very, very delicate balancing act. And on the other hand, de Gaulle in London said, you will have nothing to do with Vichy France or the Vichy intelligence operatives. That they are beyond the pale. They are the evil. And so the Secret Intelligence Service played a double game. On the one hand, they said yes, to de Gaulle's operations. Yes, we obviously are having nothing to do with anything that's going on with Vichy France or Vichy intelligence agents. And on the other hand, they were very much trying to engage and reach out to all those individuals who, before the war, they had such a close and fruitful and mutually beneficial and trusting intelligence partnership with. And the key individual in all of this was this incredible figure who I knew nothing about prior to researching Josephine's story, whose name was Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, commander. And Dunderdale, was this, to this day, is this legendary figure within secret intelligence circles. I mean, he is, he's celebrated as the example of what an intelligence agent should be like to this day, and Dunderdale had been the Paris spy master for the Secret Intelligence Service in the decade or so running up to the war, working very closely with Pelol, with Abtey, with all these figures in the Deuxième Bureau. And of course, once France falls, and it falls so quickly that no one is ready or prepared and can make contingencies, the whole of the French intelligence network is dead. And so the key task come summer of June, July, August, September of 1940 is how do all those Vichy French intelligence operatives somehow reach out to London, reconnect with the Secret Intelligence Service without the Vichy French government realizing and without de Gaulle's Free French realizing, to start the flow of intelligence happening once again, which was absolutely vital, because at that stage, of course, Britain was, reeling from the Battle of Britain, about to be reeling from the Blitz. And there were any number of other battles to fight around the world as the war spread to a truly global conflict. So that flow of intelligence, re-establishing that was absolutely key.
So Josephine, she moves from Paris to the Vichy part of France, and in the Dordogne, this marvelous chateau. I had a look at some pictures of it. It looks fantastic.
It's beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. So she's there for a bit, and then moves to and does some travel around Spain and Portugal and South America, and then moves to North Africa. So, and all along, all whilst traveling, doing these trips, she's carrying intelligence to and from the British and the French, isn't she?
Yeah. So come October, November 1940, Pelol and the Vichy French intelligence services, the shadow Vichy French intelligence service, has gathered a huge body of, vital intelligence for Britain. So, 8 German agents sent to Britain, Luftwaffe air bases, German attempts to subvert the Irish and use Ireland as a landing base to invade Britain, invasion plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion craft for Operation Sea. But they have reams of intelligence that they've gathered via their working relationship with the German occupiers, and they need to get it to London, and they have no means to do so. And so Josephine and Jacques Abtey are tasked to carry this intelligence to Portugal, which is Britain's oldest ally, of course, with a treaty dating back hundreds of years, and where there was a very active secret intelligence service office based in the British Embassy. And to get these reams of documents to Portugal, to that location, and get them back to London. And the means that they set upon to do so, again, using Josephine's stardom as their cloak and their dagger, is that she pretends and actually does organize to go on a performing tour to Lisbon, to the capital of Portugal, and from there onwards to South America, because of course the war hasn't stopped the need for people to be entertained and for entertainers to perform. And so she sets up a few, performances in Lisbon, and Abtey, her Deuxième Bureau, agent partner, becomes officially her tour manager. So he's got a false name, a false passport, and in his false passport, he has stamped the details that he is, he's a former ballet instructor from Marseille, and he's acting as her tour manager for her forthcoming Lisbon and South America tour. And all the intelligence that they've gathered is either transcribed using secret ink onto the musical score sheets that Josephine, being such a standout performer, has to carry wherever she goes on a tour in all these voluminous tour trunks, or in some cases where you couldn't do that. So with original documentation or photographs, which had to arrive in London absolutely as they were, it's hidden within her tour luggage with the hope that, because of her standout signal stardom and her incredible, the fact she's recognized and feted everywhere she goes, the hope is that, no one will think to search her luggage. And so they board a train in France, near the chateau in the Dordogne, where they've made their resistance base, and they set off for Portugal via Spain in the hope they can get all this material through, make contact with the intelligence services, British intelligence service, and get it smuggled to London. And they are also hoping to get themselves to London, Abtey and Josephine both, because they want to go there, meet with de Gaulle, and sign themselves up officially for the Free French Intelligence Services.
Josephine and Jacques Abtey, they have this wonderful relationship, which I really enjoyed reading about. Particularly, there's one moment where they're having a bit of a row, and she pinches him. It's a fantastic relationship they had. It would be great to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Josephine and Jacques Abtey, they fall in love. It's perhaps not, you could argue it's not perhaps the most professional things to do as an agent handler to his rookie agent, to his honorable correspondent. But, it was war, and, both of them were separated from and unable to make contact with their respective partners. And so, in war, these kind of relationships, were fairly common. But the standout thing about that relationship is that it endures throughout the war, and it endures throughout all the ups and downs of their espionage and intelligence adventures. In a sense, you could argue it gives their espionage partnership a certain strength and durability which it would not have had otherwise. And even after the war, that they remained the closest of friends and the most endearing and enduring supporters of each other through all their trials and tribulations post World War II. And those were not inconsiderate, because a lot of the activities that they ended up getting involved in terms of espionage really pushed the envelope in terms of what was legal and acceptable. Because in war, you have to use whatever means comes to your disposal. and you have to make alliances and partnerships with all different types of individuals, if they can help you achieve your ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal was, of course, the defeat of Nazism and the triumph of the Allies. And so in pursuing that aim, they end up involving themselves with former mafia figures and assassins and forgers and all the rest of it to try to win through.
Now, one part of the book that I found really interesting was that she meets Franco, but not the Franco's brother, Nicholas, I think it was. And what interested me was the Iberian Pact and the role it played in ensuring that Spain did not ally too closely with the Axis powers. So yeah, I was interested in that, actually, because I guess my assumption had been that Spain was, closely linked with Franco, and Hitler would have been, close partners. But the Iberian Pact suggests that wasn't the case, and that was something that Nicholas Franco was quite keen on pursuing, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, on paper, it would seem bizarre that Spain did not enter the war on the side of the Axis, especially bearing in mind, the support that both Italy, fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany had given Spain during the Spanish Civil War. I mean, tens of thousands of German and Italian troops and Air Force had fought on the side of on General Franco's side. So Spain owed the Italians and the Germans, and it's hard to understand why, especially during the early stages of the war, when on all fronts, Britain was facing defeat and Nazi Germany, the Axis powers, were triumphant. The Iberian Pact goes a little part of the way to helping explain some of that. So this alliance between Portugal and Spain, which by default tied Spain into Britain, because Portugal has such a long-standing alliance with Britain. It was kind of a backdoor means via which the fortunes of Spain could be tied more closely in with the UK. And indeed, even as the clouds of war were gathering, and it was becoming obvious that peace would not prevail, that pact was strengthened. It was strengthened by Franco, and the clauses were made more enduring in the hope that it would prevent Spain from joining Germany and Italy. And had Spain done so, and Gibraltar would certainly have fallen, and the Mediterranean would have been closed to Allied shipping, largely with Italy at one end and a Axis Allied Spain on the other, and Gibraltar gone. It could have changed the course of the war, and that was the great fear. It was an enormous fear, in fact, of Secret Intelligence Services and the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which was becoming more and more involved in Portugal and in Spain. And it was one of the things that they were actually training guerrilla forces on the ground and agents to try and prepare to counter against, should that happen, was somehow to start a guerrilla uprising within Spain itself, and on the Portuguese border, to try and strike back should Spain step over the line and join the Axis powers, and should Gibraltar be threatened. So something I didn't know very much about, and I also found surprising. I wasn't really aware of it at all.
So Josephine moves to North Africa, doesn't she, and leaves Marseille and heads to North Africa. She's immediately arrested, though, isn't she? But not for the reasons we all think she would have been arrested. She's arrested through some rather dodgy dealings by the owners of the opera house in Marseille. Is that right?
Yeah. So Josephine, after Portugal ends up in Marseille with Pelol, and she mounts La Creole, an opera, because she needs money. She needs money to perform. and she needs to maintain her cover. Crucially, Pelol says, look, you've got to maintain your cover. You've got to perform because you need to be seen as a performer. If you don't perform and you make it clear you will not perform because the Nazis are, in France, she'd said, I will never perform whilst Nazi Germany controls France. He said, you can't do that because you will blow your cover. So she puts on several performances, several weeks of performances of La Creole, which is an opera. It's a comic opera, and it was highly successful. However, come January 1941, Pelol warns her that she's basically on the Gestapo's hit list, and they're going to come and grab her, and that she's in grave danger. And he says, you have to get to the way out of this is to get to North Africa, head for Morocco, which was a French part of French North Africa. And the upside, this kind of like the other upside to this was that the intelligence pipeline, which was then going to be run from Pelol in Vichy, France, to the SIS in London, was going to be run via a steamship company called the Louis Dreyfus Steamship Company. And so that ship, which was running phosphate, a genuine phosphate business, so plying between North Africa and Portugal largely, that ship was going to be a courier vessel for intelligence dossiers, which Pelol was getting out of France to North Africa, and then from there to Portugal to be flown to London. So this was the new route for the intelligence pipeline that the SIS and Pelol's intelligence outfit had determined. And so Josephine had to sail from Marseille, very early in January 1941. And to do so, she had to truncate her performances of La Creole. And a deal was cut with the opera managers that they said, if you can get a doctor's certificate to say that you are too ill to perform, we can invoke our insurance clause and everyone will be happy. And they said, we understand you're a true French patriot and we're right behind you. So as long as you can get us that doctor's certificate, it's not an issue. So Josephine went to see a medic in Marseille, and actually she was ill. I mean, it was a record cold winter, and she'd caught an infection on her chest. And the doctor actually genuinely said, you need to go to a sunny part of the world and recuperate. And so she'd sailed to North Africa, believing that everything was squared away with the opera, with the Marseille Opera, and that that they had no truck with what she was doing. But she arrived in North Africa to get arrested, fearing, of course, that she was being seized by the Vichy authorities, it being French North Africa, because they'd been told by their German Nazi bosses to seize her. And actually, she was being arrested because the managers of the Marseille Opera had decided that she owed them 400,000 francs, and they were not going to stand by their agreement. And it took a personal intervention from Paul Pelol, the intelligence boss from Marseille, to actually get her released. And so, yeah, it was kind of like not quite the expected arrival she'd been hoping for.
Outrageous behavior. Now, I wanted to, because we're running out of time, but she had, at the same time, actually, I might have this wrong, and you can clear it up for me, but Winston Churchill is sort of heading to Morocco around about the same time. And she has a kind of... she says that she exchanged telegrams with Churchill. Is that right?
Yeah. So she found Churchill. Well, she found de Gaulle and Churchill both hugely inspirational figures, and she was amazed and heartened by, in particular, Churchill's ability to stand at the world's darkest hour, not just Britain's darkest hour, but the world's darkest hour, and to never falter. She did not know where that constancy, that belief, that unbelievable courage and single-mindedness came from, but she absolutely applauded it, and it inspired her. It gave her strength. And she had performed in the UK prior to the war, and she was invited by Churchill at the end of the war to come and be the standout performer for the VE Day celebrations. And so the two were known to each other. And yes, she did. She did exchange telegrams with Churchill after the war. and there was a friendship maintained. And Churchill arrived actually in Morocco, where Josephine and Jacques Abtey ended up being based as part of the Casablanca Conference. So when the American and British Operation Torch landings happened in North Africa, Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin were supposed to come, but of course couldn't make it, met to try to determine the ongoing course of the war. And at that stage, there was a realization among the senior Allied commanders in North Africa that Josephine in North Africa could again play this kind of central, vital role. One, in pulling together this disparate alliance of, former Vichy French, Free French, North Africans, British and American troops, because she was this iconic international figure. She who was such a cheerleader for the Allied cause. So they gave her this role of kind of being this figure to pull the coalition together and to give it strength and meaning. And the means of doing so largely was that she launched these series of epic, death-defying tours where she and a bunch of fellow performers, and largely Jacques Abtey as well, boarded battered old vehicles, jeeps if they could get hold of them, and travelled the length and breadth of North Africa, performing to anyone from world leaders down to the troops on the front lines, and were attacked by the German Air Force and suffered many trials and tribulations. But a leopard doesn't change its spots. And the really interesting thing about Josephine's espionage work was that by now, we're talking late 43, early 44, she had, the student had become the master. So from being the uncertain student of espionage under Jacques Abtey, she had gone off and carried out numerous solo espionage operations herself alone, when Jacques Abtey could not travel because he didn't have the visas and the profile that she did, and was constrained from going anywhere. And so she'd really taken flight as a true master of espionage. And realizing that, the Allies set a final kind of, espionage duty across North Africa, which was to try to work out how serious was the danger that the peoples of North Africa would believe the Nazi propaganda that Nazi Germany was an answer to British imperialism and French colonialism, and that joining forces with Berlin and Hitler would actually be an antidote to the many decades of colonialism that had pertained in those areas. And so her role was to sound out the level of unrest and resistance, and to work out how to keep the anti-Nazi coalition together for long enough to win North Africa, which was vital because that was the springboard for the liberation of Southern Europe.
Well, she's a hugely successful agent, and so I mean the story is just so fantastic. But I just wanted to end it really talking about herself. She always wanted children, and she was unable to have them, and she also suffered some very serious illnesses during the war as well. So I just wanted to if you could talk a little bit about that, because it really does, I guess. It's a real testament to her sort of strength that she got through all these trials and tribulations.
Yeah, I mean, the war is very nearly the death of her many times over, and she, for many months in Marseille, in Marseille in North Africa, Casablanca in North Africa, she's in a clinic, in the Comte clinic, a private clinic in Casablanca, fighting at death's door. Now, some people have argued that she may not have been as ill as it was maintained all the time. The reason being that her clinic, the Comte clinic, became this perfect espionage hub. It became the dead letter drop for Abtey and all these agents working across North Africa. It became the inviolable meeting place for all the agents that they were running in their network. So Josephine was this kind of standout iconic figure that anyone could go and visit, because everybody had an interest in her well-being, and anybody could take any intelligence they wanted to her, drop it there for onward transmission to London and Washington, because by that stage, of course, they were largely serving as agents for the British and the Americans. And so, yeah, she fought the Grim Reaper many times over, and at many stages, Dr. Comte, the chief medic of the Comte Clinic, and Jacques Abte and others who were close to her, believed that she was no longer for this world. And by 1946, she was hospitalized again in Paris because the war had really, really, those years of back-to-back operations, the stress, the intrigue, the exhausting pace of operations had absolutely taken her to the limit and beyond. And largely because of those illnesses she suffered through the war, she wasn't able to have children, which was her great dream in life, was to raise a family. And so really she gave everything, you could argue, and more to the war effort. And, one of the standout things about Josephine Baker after the war is that whenever she was asked, because of course she went back to being a performer, and whenever she was asked what was the greatest standout, episode of her life, she would not say, "Oh, when I performed the X," or, when I appeared in Y movie. She would always say the war years. So the war years were the watershed moment. They were the making of her. They were the years that changed her from being a standout, glitzy, acclaimed performer into being a serious mover on the world stage who became a campaigner for freedom and liberty in all its forms for the rest of her life, as well as being a standout performer. So for her, yeah, this was her time. The war was her time. She paid so much for it, but it was her standout moment in her life.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end it, I think, Damien. Fantastic book, The Flame of Resistance. Highly recommended. Incredible, an incredible woman. Thanks very much, Damien.
Thank you very much. Really good to be on.
I do hope you enjoyed that story. What an amazing woman. Now, coming up, we've got Con Iggulden. He's a historical fiction author of great success, talking about Pericles and 5th century Athens. Anthony Beaver, interviewed by friend of the show Rob Lyman about the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and Rob and myself will be chatting about that interview. Then we've got Gretchen Freeman on the Anglo-Irish Treaty that was 100 years ago, so there's plenty of great content still to come. You can get hold of me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ. Damien is at Author D. Lewis, and there are links in the show notes, and I'll leave you until next week. Thank you, and good night.